Our session, the last session for this evening before an evening of fun and frolic, is called the East Meets West, Re-Understanding India. The idea of this session was that we should, given the amount of change that is being talked about, and it's very evident to anyone who is watching the economy, watching politics, watching economic indicators, that somewhere it's not just India, the world has recalibrated. Your expectations from growth, your expectations of performance, your expectations of expansion, managing your costs, hiring people, I think everything in terms of expectations and possibilities have been recalibrated. And in that context, where does India stand? Where do CFOs and Indian businesses stand? I'm absolutely delighted to have an outstanding panel. We've got Ajit Ranade, the Chief Economist of the Aditya Birla Group and one of the most authoritative voices on matters of economic import. Certainly the Indian economy, but he watches the globe for his own businesses, and he is a very incredible combination of an economist and a practitioner in some sense. Ajit is going to talk to us a little bit about what has changed in the globe, what are the economic indicators to watch for both for the world economy and the Indian economy, what does the world view India as, how have things changed in terms of the world's expectations and views of India as a growth and an investment market, and equally, how does India continue to view itself? Once he's set the context, we'll have Deepak Ghaisa, the chairman of Gencoval Services, which focuses on emerging opportunities in India. He has been the CEO of iFlex, which is now called Oracle Financial Services, but was one of the more celebrated CFOs and CEOs of the last decade, to talk about what is the Indian company's response to the challenges at hand, and equally how must Indian CFOs think about the environment. Can I invite Deepak to join me on the stage? We are also joined by Rakesh Singh, the CEO of Aditya Birla Finance. He is responsible for driving the company to a leadership position in his sector in the last 15 years. He spent 15 years at Stan Chatsauri before that, with his most recent assignment as General Manager for the SME sector. He is going to talk to us about the backbone of the Indian economy, which is the mid-size segment, and how that is getting impacted by the world economy, the Indian economy, and what the SME sector's response is likely to be going forward. May I invite Rakesh Singh to join me on the stage? Please give our panel a big hand. Ajit, the way we'll do this is I'm going to ask you to speak to us for about 5-7 minutes, set the context, then I'll ask Deepak and then Mr. Singh, and then we'll open the floor to questions and answers. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Anuradha. Am I audible there to everybody?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks again for inviting me to this panel. Thanks especially to Anuradha, and good to see old friends Deepak and Rakesh there. Hi to you guys. And I know it's no match to not actually being there in Goa. So please excuse me for not having been able to come there. So good evening, folks. I know this is the last session of the day, and it's a crime to be in Goa and to be locked indoors.
You're my friend.
Talking about serious things like inflation and interest rates, so we will try and keep this a little light. I will spend just a few minutes giving you, trying to share some outside-in perspective. For starters, I just want to highlight some events and reactions to them, which tend to throw our conventional understanding sort of out of kilter. Now, if you remember, you go back 2 years ago, I think it was exactly August 2011, a very big event happened on 2nd of August. I hope you remember. That event was that a rating agency called Standard & Poor did the unthinkable. They downgraded the rating of United States, the sovereign rating, from AAA to AA. That was like supposed to be an earth-shaking event because US sovereign has always been the gold standard. If you don't believe that, just ask the Chinese. They have almost $3 trillion in foreign exchange reserves, and almost entirely, maybe 80% or more, is invested in US sovereign bonds. So clearly the most preferred and safest destination for investors, risk-free, has been the US Treasury bonds. And imagine the US sovereign rating being downgraded. The S&P in its rationale said that the rating downgrade was not due to conventional reasons like concerns about fiscal deficit or debt or solvency or capability to repay outstanding payments, but due to a very strange reason. And that reason was that they were alarmed at the nature of partisanship in the US polity was reflected in their Congress or their parliament, what we call parliament. So really the rating downgrade was simply because they were alarmed at the fact that the Congress was not able to come up to a consensus on many decisions. And of course the big decision, as you know, was about this so-called cliff, fiscal cliff. That how to increase, the US needed to increase its borrowing limits, that is the US Treasury, the US government is deeply into debt, but every time it comes to a ceiling, it needs authorization from Congress to increase that ceiling. And it has done so several times. During the time of Bush presidency, they did it seven or eight times. And nobody even raised an eyebrow because it's a routine thing. Any economy which is growing will obviously, just like your company, when it's growing, your working capital limits need to grow. But this particular time during the first presidency of Obama, it became a partisan issue. Anyway, I'm just recalling that not for the fact that the S&P did the unthinkable, but the reaction to that. Whenever a country's rating is downgraded, what do you normally expect from the bonds? What happens to bond prices? Typically the bond yields go up and bond prices fall. In the US context, exactly the opposite happened. Namely, there was a big, huge bond rally and bond yields fell. So I just thought I'd put that little incident as a sort of the kind of things that are going on. The global economy has a lot of this very unusual, unconventional, unintuitive developments going on. It's one small country or another which is causing a lot of havoc or disruptions in the global economy. For example, there's a small country called Greece. I don't know, it's probably GDP is less than 1% of the EU. EU is made up of 27, now 28 countries, there are 28 members, and Greece is one of them, and the GDP of Greece is about 1%. 30 to 40% of the GDP is accounted for only by two countries, Germany and France. And yet, the fiscal situation of Greece was able to cause such a big tremor all around the world. People started thinking about, is this the breakup of the EU? Is this going to be a complete downward spiral? Is it the meltdown of the EU? So, that's another example. And of course, nothing like that happened. And just for your information, in case you think Greece has the highest debt to GDP ratio, the Greece debt, the outstanding debt divided by its own GDP, which by the way has been falling every year. GDP growth in Greece has been minus 5%, minus 10% for the last 2-3 years. The debt to GDP ratio is about 160% today. The debt to GDP ratio in Italy is 120%. In Belgium is 125%. In Portugal is also more than 100%. And we keep thinking that the whole thing was described as a sovereign debt crisis in Europe. But little do we know, or we don't even think about it, that the most indebted nation in the world, in terms of this metric, is not Greece. It's not even any European country. It's not even USA, which as I said, the fiscal situation is worsening, but the debt to GDP ratio in the US is about 60%. For India, it is 80% including foreign debt. The country which has a nearly 300% debt to GDP ratio is Japan. Until recently the second largest economy in the world and one of the richest per capita incomes in the world. And today we are thinking Japan is actually on a huge upswing. In fact, the Japanese currency went all the way strengthened all the way to 80 or 82. So I'm just giving the second example. So the first example was the US downgrade causing a bond rally. The second example is that debt to GDP ratio of the highest indebted country in the world being actually not a cause for concern at all. So in context of all this, I just want to put before you that it becomes difficult to read the tea leaves in the global economy. Conventional logic of using conventional indicators like current account deficits, indebtedness, debt to GDP ratios, these are no longer useful to get a macroeconomic assessment. So one has to use a combination. The other example, just like Greece was able to hold the attention of the entire global economy for a little while. Now this year we have a small country called Syria, which again, as if everything that happens there is going to determine the course of the global economy. So it's not like that. So the short comment is that actually the global economy had this build-up bubble phase in the first half of this decade, and it came to a very unsustainable level. The financial sectors became so big that in proportion, in comparison to the real sector or the real economy, that there had to be a correction. And the correction happened in 2008, 2009, 5 years ago. But within a few years, we are back to levels which were the normal course of growth for the global economy. Most economies have recovered the GDP that they had in 2009. Global growth is coming back to around 3.5–4%, which is the normal sustainable growth for the world. Western countries are coming slowly back. So we can no longer go back to the days, that anomalous decade between 2003, 2007, or the first half of 2000. We're just coming back, where we will now get used to 4% growth GDP globally and reasonable amounts of debts and current account deficits. One final comment on India, that when you read all of this, again, it's useful to put things in context. In 2006, India crossed a very important milestone. We became a $1 trillion economy. That is $1 trillion measured at the exchange rate of 2006. 7 years later, in 2013, we are close to being a $2 trillion economy. So in 2006, we were growing at approximately 9% GDP growth. So now that we are twice as big today, we need to grow only at half the growth rate. So if we were growing at 9% then, we need to grow at around 4.5% now to add the same amount of GDP. But actually we are growing at 5%. And the outlook for next year is about 5.5 to 6%. So I just want to put that in context. So stripped of all the bad gloom and doom headlines and the really bad situation that perhaps some of you might be experiencing or reading about, the fact is that we are just back to, levels and growth rates which I think are the ones which from the long-term sustainability point of view is what we should see. And one last final comment on the rupee depreciation. For the last 5 years, India has had a high inflation, relatively. If you look at our 50 years of history, we never had sustained double-digit inflation for 5–6 years in a row. We've had an average inflation rate of 10%. So just imagine, if you have inflation of 10% for 5 years, what do you think happens to the currency? It becomes half, right? 100 rupees will be worth 50 rupees in 5 years, because 10% per year for 5 years. So exactly that's what happened to the exchange rate. We were near 40, we became 60. But all this looks, logical and sensible only in hindsight. But when the rupee raced between 50 to 60, 65, I think it overshot. Of course, people became panicky. Everything, as if we started thinking that this is completely meaningless. It's just too much panic, too much overreaction. In fact, we did have a panic reaction from the Reserve Bank. But I think, just step back and look at some of this global event, including India external perspective. I think great. I just wanted to put these a few observations on board, and maybe we can take some of these things into discussion. So, thank you, and over to you, Anuradha.
Thanks, Ajit. I think lots to mull over, but I think what he's left us with sets us up for, Deepak, your comments on what do you expect corporates to do. Ajit talked a little bit about inflation. I think he's talking obviously about this impact on the currency, but as corporates, what does this do to your expectations of being able to attract capital, to be able to raise money? There's constantly conversation around how people who are looking for dollar investments in India, whatever they had expected as returns has come to nothing. But what does all of this mean for corporations in India, and what does it mean for CFO? Would you like to speak from here?
Good evening. It's a pleasure to meet you all, and talking after Ajit after he has told us about world economy and India in context. And I was lucky enough to hear my friend Anil what advice he gave you, or gave all of us rather. Quickly, while every conference nowadays or every TV talk show shows the gloomy picture of Indian economy or probably world economy, and every professional or every entrepreneur starts thinking where the hell we are going and what the hell we are doing. But with my experience, I will tell you that when I'm a qualified chartered accountant, but most of the chartered accountants don't believe I'm any more chartered accountant. I went to the food industry. Even today I'm on board of one of the offshore food industry in Singapore. Then 20 years I spent in IT, but technologists obviously don't believe that I'm a technology guy. And last 4 years, or rather 3 years, I'm biotechnology, studying molecular biology, stem cells, and nowadays, more often than chartered accountants, I give lectures to doctors and discuss the new technologies that are coming up in regenerative medicine. So I'm very glad that you called me first and recognized me as a originally chartered accountant and a finance guy. But in my career, I did, especially in iFlex, 16 acquisitions, gone into 132 countries as customers with global layout, around 18 entities spread across the world. And now straight away to the new innovative concept of stem cell therapies and stem cell business, a biotechnology business. So every time I saw that the things are going down, I think I always saw the opportunity in it. And every time, my belief is that every CFO or all of you should see the opportunity whenever everyone else feels there is a threat in the economy, in the business, in the world. And I'm not just telling you as more of a sermon, but this is how I managed or performed and my own experiences. Anil talked about IPOs. I remember in 2002 when we did IPO, nobody was there in the market to do IPO. Probably ours was the first one after that big scam happened in some 2001 on the stock market. And people were laughing at us that why we were doing IPO at all at this juncture when markets are so bad, especially the stock markets. And we thought we should do that because we were going to do only 10% IPO of the equity. The lowest price, and then the only thing what we can show investors is upside. And that's precisely what happened in last 6 years and post IPO. So we did at the valuation of around $430 million, and we ultimately sold it to Oracle at around $4.5 billion. That was the sort of opportunity we saw in the worst capital markets. I would not compare, though there are a lot of similarities between 91 and 2013, but I think in 1991, most of us in businesses were looking for survival, while today in 2013, there's a sea change in mindset of most of us, is that we are not looking for survival, we are looking for growth, even in the given situation. So I think a quick sort of formula, since I got 7 minutes to talk and it was very difficult to comprehend in 7 minutes, I always think of a formula which Albert Einstein gives, G is equal to mc square. My formula is G is equal to mc square, where G is growth and mc square in mathematics is mc into c, that makes mc square. C is the change, which is constant, and mc is your ability to manage the change. And if your ability to manage the change is positive, C being constant, obviously the G is going to be positive. If your ability to manage the change is negative, then growth is going to be negative. And how you do that ability to manage the change is very, very important. And coming to very, very pragmatic examples or aspects is, I was just trying to coin a word, and then I arrived at a word called legis. So legis is first is L, which is liquidity. I think in these days, rather than worrying about the profits and P&L account, I would more worry about the cash flows to ensure that the liquidity is intact. Because the money is here, is there in the market, how you manage your liquidity is very, very going to be important. I'm not going into details of that because the cost of time. E is expansion. I mean, this is a time probably I think, and she talked about the getting foreign loans. I would say that we should see the opportunities, what Ajit was talking about, the countries where the multiples are cheapest, and you can actually go there and start working or expanding there your business. And I think some companies are trying in Africa, but I would rather go to the European countries where we can. And a friend of mine has actually acquired a company in Italy in chemical business, and he's doing extremely well now. So try to look at the expansions not in African countries where the markets are still to be explored, but the markets where the markets are available, finance or funding is cheaper, and people are waiting for you to come and sort of make them survive. I think we have management skills, we have got great talent available, we should encash that talent as much as possible. So that is, I would say, the expansion. The only thread there is that most of the companies, at least in IT industry what I saw, going up to $100 million revenue was not a big deal. Was a big deal, because that is the first milestone that you get. $100 to $500 million was almost automatic in those days at least. But $500 million to $1 billion, where every company wanted to reach $1 billion, made all wrong decisions on inorganic growth, wrong acquisitions, money put in the wrong place, and there is a big problem. But at the same time, if I look at the balance sheets in, say, S&P 500 companies, none of them today are getting into acquisitions, and there is $1.3 trillion cash sitting idle in those books and balance sheets if you sum up all those balance sheets of S&P 500. If that is the situation, I think liquidity is available provided you are able to expand your own business in a right way. I think still I believe India is a great market and it is a great potential. So that is LE. G is growth, which I talked about, the formula that I talked, that you should be able to manage the change well. And in the old days when we studied, we used to make those 5 years strategic plans, but I don't think we can anyone think of 5 year strategic plan. Make a year strategic plan and still keep it flexible, and don't keep it sort of static, so that you can change it the way in which you want it flexibly to your benefit and advantage. So that is G. I is innovation, and innovation is something which each one of you should think. And I always believe that the innovation should be done when the things are at top. So people who started getting into innovative markets, innovative products, innovative processes in 2008-9 when things were running like 10% and 12% and 14%, or in some industries like IT still was running with 20-25%, pharma was running with 20%. Retail was running. I mean, those are the companies where I'm on the board, so I understand those industries better. So that was the time when you should have thought about the innovation. But even today, I don't think it's late. Try to evolve something innovative, either a product, delivery mechanism, processes, whereby you will stand out and gain advantage even in the difficult positions. And S, of course, is last, which is survival. So you should be able to survive out of this. So while you enter the door in new era, in a new building, in a new room, before you enter the room, I think first you find out where is the door to exit. And unless you see that door to exit, don't enter that room. I mean, that is my simple advice to all of you, that never enter the room where you don't know where the exiting door is. So, and that is required today. In those days, in 2008-9, and when I entered in 90, like 91 or late in the century, I think all of us were entering the room without even realizing where is the exit route available because the things were going very high. Mindsets were different. But today the risk factors are very high. I also share with Anil his views on corporate governance, that I think in long run, in tough times, what will make you survive is a good corporate governance. It may not give you the short-term benefits, and you as CFO or all of us as CFOs, we have a chance to change that system to make it right and put in corporate governance. I was lucky enough to be in IT industry, so most of us followed those corporate governance norms. And I still remember when in SEEPS, when only IT industry was there, no custom officer used to ask for money any point of time. But moment Gem jewelry industry came, all of a sudden the scenario changed and corporate governance became a big issue for us. And so most of us actually came out of SEEPS then. And we started on STPs. So in survival, I think corporate governance is going to be very important. And if all these aspects are taken care, I think even in tough times like today, all of us can see the opportunity to go forward and make a sea change between the way in which we were working before, or way in which we were conducting our business before, and the way in which we can conduct business going forward. I think we follow that, probably times are not going to be tough. Even the world will feel that it's tough time. As a company, as a corporate, as an industry, I think you can make a hell lot of difference the way in which things will move for you. Thank you.
Thank you. That was insightful and dot on time. So, can I ask Rakesh Singh to, I think he has a few slides, so if I can ask you to walk us through his slides and then we'll take questions.
The topic for the session was West meets East, and for me specifically it was SME, just focusing it on SME. So what I'll do is, I'll just take you through a brief presentation. If you look at, Dr. Ranade really emphasized on how the world economy is so well integrated today. It's so integrated and interdependent on one another that you can't really isolate one incident or one country from the other. So, example of a Greece where the dependence on the EU was 1%, and that really impacted the global economy. So, similar, if we look at, I think the interdependency of our corporates sitting here in India, our SMEs, across the globe is so strong. Another example of interdependence is, look at the way the stock markets behaves, and people who track stock markets regularly. So the first thing in the morning they will say, how was the US market? Yeah, so they will track what happened in the US market yesterday evening, then they will track what happened in the Asian markets first in the morning, and then by 2 o'clock when the European markets open, they track that the Sensex goes down, up or down, because the European markets have opened. So I think it's such a well integrated globe we have, that really one incident can impact any country, any economy. And if we look at what is our contribution to the globe trade, as in India we have $770 billion of trade, which is only 2.5%. Being the 4th largest economy in the world, I think we can do much better on that front, and that can multiply. Even if it has to go up to 5%, we are talking about $1,500 billion. So I think that's also, if we look at the FDI, the foreign direct investments coming in, more than 50% of the foreign direct investments have gone into emerging markets. So wherever the returns are good, wherever there is a predictability of income and there is an environment, the money will flow in there. So we have to make an environment which is conducive for investment. And that's what the Indian economy and Indian policymakers have to really strive towards making that possible. If we look at how competitive we are in terms of the global economy, in terms of the World Economic Report, India ranked 59th in terms of the global competitiveness index. And we have fallen down 10 positions in the last 4 years, which clearly shows how competitive we are. We need to really improve a lot on our service standards and the product standards. So and we are behind all the BRIC nations, and we are behind by China by 30 positions. So I think a huge amount of work which needs to be done by our SMEs, by our corporates, by our product management team, and the new products which we develop has to meet the global standards. If we look at from 2011 onwards, rupee has been depreciating, and Dr. Ranade mentioned about the reason was because the inflation in India for the last 5-6 years have been it's quite high, and that was a catch-up game. And if the rupee is depreciating, your exports, if it's doing well, your earning improves. But if you look at the correlation, our exports were also declining. So that clearly shows that we are not very competitive in terms of our exports as well. And a lot needs to be done to really improve our the service, the products. What's happening currently, I think everyone knows, so I don't want to really repeat that. And the new RBI governor is doing a lot of things in terms of course correction. But he can only do on several symptoms which are there in the economy. I think the core issue is how do we get the manufacturing setup in place, how do we improve our service standards so that we can compete with the global companies and we can compete in the global market. And that's what we need to really work on. As Anuradha mentioned, I think at the beginning of the session, SMEs are the backbone of any economy. Yeah? In developing countries, they contribute more than 50% to the GDP of the economy. Here in India, it contributes only close to 14-15% of the economy. So that really provides an opportunity. We have a huge and a long way to go towards improving the contribution to the gross domestic income. And in spite of contributing only 14-15%, they contribute to 40% of the exports of the economy, 20% of imports, and they provide employment to close to 30 million people. So the sooner we realize the potential of this segment and really put all enablers behind this, is that we can really propel and make this SME segment backbone of Indian economy as well. What are the solutions? What do we really need to look at? There are countries which are completely export focused. So look at a country like South Korea, China. They are completely export focused. If you look at Vietnam, Indonesia, they are domestic focused. What is the option or for that matter, if we are looking at few countries, UK, Japan, they are on the knowledge-based economy. So what are the options India can look at? I think India can look at both because we have a huge domestic market with us. To cater to that market, we need to do a lot. So we need to focus on our domestic market as well as the export market. And like most of the solutions in India is the middle part. I think we have to look at both the options, which is domestic focused and export focused. Because until unless you do exports, your physical deficit and your trade, I think that's where we need to. So it has to be a balance, both domestic as well as the export. There are huge challenges. Infrastructure challenges, I think, is huge. For which funding is another big challenge for the SMEs. The access. More than 60% of the SMEs, they don't get any bank facilities. Or how do we really reach out to them? And there has to be some innovative way of reaching out to them, because just by a bank branch or a NBFC branch, I think we really can't reach out to the last SME in the country. So how do we really look at providing them the capital which can really make them produce international standard products which can be marketed globally? So I think funding is one of the big challenges, and being from the banking industry and from the lending industry, I I want to focus because the infrastructure, I think government has to do a lot more there because there are huge wastages when you don't have electricity for 24 hours and your roads are not good enough. There's huge amount of material wastages which are there. So you really can't compete with the global companies in the global market. So, but I want to really focus on what as a lending institution one can do to really reach out to these SMEs and make them competitive. Access to capital, and as everyone says, I think capital is very, very scarce. It has to, it reaches out to the people who are deserving. So I think it's very, very important that the SMEs should go get the SME ratings done. They should get rating because there are a lot of SMEs which are family-run businesses. How do we get the professional approach to them? Get it rated by CRISIL, SMERA, and only look. Today we have 1% of the SMEs which are externally rated. So if someone has to really invest in a SME, how do you really establish the cash flows and the health of that company? So it's very important that one should extend and go out, get it rated, get a professional outlook and professional management to run the company. Liquidity, ease of liquidity or the debt, I think the working capital, which is a very, very important from a SME point of view. How do you really get the working capital going? The way the business happens or the working capital limits are given, you assess a working capital limits once a year. If a company which is growing quarter on quarter and if it needs a working capital, I think there should be a mechanism that they can raise money through alternate route if the banks are not able to meet the requirements. So I think the over-dependence on banks, I think we need to look at how they can access the money, the public money through SME exchange, which was initiated a few years back and it hasn't clicked. I think we need to really look at what one needs to do to really make that click. And operational and risk management. I think risk management, because in such a volatile world where one event triggers either the stock market going up by 300 points or going down by 300 points or the rupee going up by one rupee in the next day or the bond rates going up or down. I think the environment is so volatile. How do you really manage your risks? Whether it's a currency risk, so you hedge your currency. How do you really maximize your yields? So a lot of thought which has to go in terms of really looking for innovative solutions for this sector to really become competitive in the global market. The way we are going, we might not be able to continue to do whatever we are doing because the world is catching up. Smaller countries like Vietnam, Taiwan, they are doing so well. So unless we really put our act together, it will be very, very difficult for this segment to really compete in the world stage. As the CFOs of the companies, I think what you should look at is how do you really provide the best working capital solution for your businesses, and whether it can mean from a working capital facilities to supply chain management and factoring. There are different. So one needs to look at what is the most efficient way of borrowing, and what is the yield maximization, what is the risk management which is there in your P&L, and so how do you really manage that in the broader context of your business and the requirement of your business. Thank you. Thanks, Anuradha.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. If we can have Ajit back. So, I guess all the three speakers have left us with quite different views. Ajit seemed to suggest that it's not as bad as it looks. Deepak, at least what I took away from it was that it's still time to go out, find the opportunities and still chase growth. Rakesh expectedly seems to be suggesting far more caution or tougher times for SMEs and how to find their way out. So I'm going to open the floor to question and answers. To questions, if there's anybody who would like to kick off. Yes, Joy.
Question for Ajit. See, I'm not asking for a prediction of where the sort of exchange rates are moving, but would you expect, let's say, over the next 1 year term, to remain at current levels or within this current band that we are seeing, or do you expect it to, be substantially weaker?
Yeah, see, in my initial comments, I mentioned the outside in perspective of India exchange rate, that if you were sitting outside India and you were watching this domestic inflation, it was very clear that if the domestic purchasing power of the rupee was declining at the rate of 10% per year, surely the external purchasing power, that is the exchange rate, also should be commensurate. I mean, when we live in India, we perhaps get blinded by domestic, we don't see it as clearly, but I think it looks very clear that the internal power of purchasing power of rupee and external purchasing power of rupee should move neck to neck. I mean, I think there should be some correlation, right? And that's why no wonder that the rupee, which used to be 5 years ago in the low 40s, has moved to 60. This is a 50% movement. But having said that, I think what happened is, just like in the financial market, the currency market also tends to get carried away. So there was overshooting, it went overshot to perhaps 65, 70. So I believe that the fair value for the rupee is closer to 60, 62, 63. I mean, of course, you can't pinpoint these things. And in fact, one of the reasons that we had a very large current account deficit was because perhaps the rupee was overvalued, making imports cheaper and more attractive than domestic production, which also partly reflects how industrial production has slowed down and so on. So if you agree with me about the rupee's fair value right now to be around 61, 62, then it should move in that, and then in the years to come, it will depreciate at the rate at which there is an inflation differential between, let's say, the rupee and the dollar, which is the term that we have used for the last 20 years anyway.
Deepak, Rakesh, do you have a view as well?
Oh, he's an expert.
Yeah.
He is. I think he's right. It should be around 60, 62 is our sense as well.
Deepak?
Well, I mean, I would say that I will not make my decision based on predictions of exchange rate. I'm trying to be more pragmatic. I'm not as clever, intelligent as Ajit is. But I have to run a business. I mean, if it goes to 70, what should I do? We should go to 60. What should be my plan? So, point is that you should not get surprised by any movement at any point of time, and that's the way you should play your game. Once you understand and learn to play that game, I think you can do much better. I mean, we were talking about going up the mountain. I think the game I love most is boxing because boxing.
Oh, boxing.
Because you never get defeated because you fall, but because if you can't get up after that, then you are defeated. Right? So business is like that. You might get knocked down a couple of times because of the exchange rate or various other n number of variables that you may come across. But don't bother too much about it. Be prepared. Don't get surprised. Get up again.
Can I get quick reactions from the room? 60, 62? One person. The rest? 70? 55? Sorry? 65? 65? How many for 65?
That is consensus, is it?
50%. 50% of the room thinks 65. Okay? Anybody else? Any other questions? Yes, Ravi.
My question is regarding this inflation, because we have seen 5 years of inflation continuously in double digit, and RBI is basically all the ammunition to control this inflation regarding interest rate hikes and completely failed to control it. Basically, it created the other side of supply side is choking and all those things where the demand side continues to grow, and that is again. So, what do you think the RBI should do? What is your advice to the new Raghunath regarding this to curb this, control this inflation?
Yeah, this is the thing. If you ask me what is the central challenge of India today, is actually on inflation. It is on why is it for the last 50, 60 years, we were able to keep inflation, not just inflation, but inflationary expectations below 10%. I mean, of course, if you go and ask the Aam Aadmi or the housewife, they would say, like, Mehngai, they always say the inflation is much more than what you report in the newspapers. But I'm saying if you consistently have been following the WPI based inflation, which is the official benchmark rate which we follow for many years, that they've never allowed it to run at double digit consistently for 5 or 6 years in a row. So I think that is probably one of the biggest challenge that we have, macroeconomic challenge, and how to not only reduce the inflation but keep inflationary expectations also in the 5 to 7% range, 5 to 6% range. And there is no point blaming oil prices and Syria and taper policy of the Fed and all kinds of those factors. I think it is our problem. Inflation is our problem. We have a new RBI governor, and if you, those of you who have read his speech or had the opportunity to listen to him, he said very clearly that I am going to refer to the 1934 RBI Act. Now, my fundamental mandate is monetary stability, or in other words, protecting the value of the currency, which means not exchange rate, but it's stability of rupee, protecting the value of the rupee. What should the RBI do? Well, it's an old-fashioned answer, but I think inflation is a monetary phenomenon. Inflation simply means there's too much money chasing too little goods, whether it is from supply factors, demand factors, agriculture, bottlenecks, whatever the reason, money is money. So I think we will have to expect some amount of monetary tightness. But, having said that, I should not put myself in a position where you start asking me about interest rates. So, I think we should expect the RBI to be, upwards from June and July, they have been totally focused on the exchange rate. I think that's a temporary dilation. They will come back to focus on inflation before they can start looking at growth. As I said, even at 4.5% growth rate, since we are twice as large as 2006, 4.5% to 5% is not a bad growth rate for a $2 trillion economy. But 10% inflation rate is bad news. Inflation affects everybody, rich and poor, Aam Aadmi or Khas Aadmi.
Thank you. Yes, just one second.
Sir, I think this rupee depreciation will give very good opportunity for domestic players. What is your opinion? Domestic manufacturers, it will give big opportunity.
If you're saying that has rupee depreciation helped domestic manufacturing, yes, I believe so, because in sectors like textiles, footwear, gems and jewelry, even petroleum refining, the great Reliance company, or even Deepak's former association with the IT industry, they are very happy if the rupee goes to 70 or even 75. But I think those are all temporary advantages in competitiveness. Like I think Rakesh referred to the fact that India's competitiveness rank has gone down. So competitiveness does not come from artificial adrenaline like the rupee currency. It gives you some temporary advantage, perhaps for a year or so, but as Deepak will confirm, what happens is your customer gets wise and they start reducing your dollar rate downwards. So whatever advantage you felt you got in your weak rupee, they take it away from you by reducing their rate. Even that happens in textile ready-made garments, whether your customer is Walmart or Marks and Spencer. So I guess we should, whoever can enjoy the benefits of the rupee going to 68, 69, it may also jump to 70 by the next 1 month if the meeting on September 17th produces some kind of a shock. I don't think it will, but if it does, but I believe fundamentally the fair value of the rupee is closer to 60, 62, 60. And in any case, industrial
seeing is, the successive governments, they have been following actually vote bank politics. So you had, in the earlier days, you had this, support on the minimum wage program. So, there was productive assets being built, and, the government used to ensure that over 100 days of, labor, they would actually compensate the farm guys. But over the last 2 years, you had NREGA, and now you have the, the food bill. What do you think would be the scenario probably a year down the line or 2 years down the line when actually this food bill, actually gets rolled out? In a scenario where you probably don't have monsoons, but even if you have good monsoons, ensuring 5 or 25 kg of that food grain to the poor, wouldn't that actually distort the sort of farming, because everybody will get into this whatever rice or wheat cultivation as against doing the other crops? I mean, how do you think this will impact inflation and life in general?
First of all, MNREGA, that law was passed all India level in October 2005, and the predecessor to that law is something called the Employment Guarantee Scheme, which has been running in the state of Maharashtra since 1972. The NREGA was supposed to, completely distort the labor market. But the fact is, now we have data for the last 8 years. In most of the years, we have underspent the budget. In no years has the budget spending on NREGA been more than 35,000 crores. The total size of the budget, by the way, is 15 lakh crores. The total size of India's labor force is 440 million, 450 million. So therefore, total employment created in India, assuming everybody is working, is 450 million into 300 person days, which is a huge number. The NREGA employment as a fraction of that number is less than 0.5%. So that is the context of NREGA. That it is a very favorite whipping boy, especially I am aware of that in many discussions that I participate also in chambers of commerce and so on. But the fact is that as a fraction of employment that it has taken away from productive employment, if you think so, it's actually not even 0.5%. It has, however, created a wage floor, because minimum wages paid in NREGA is about 100 rupees per day, and this 100 rupees happens to be higher than what was being paid in some states. Not in Kerala, not in Maharashtra, not in Tamil Nadu, but in some other northern states. So it has created a wage, but in the absence of any social security in India, there is no unemployment social security, there are no health benefits. In the absence of that, the NREGA wage floor acts as a proxy social security in India. Until we get a full-fledged social security system, which will take many, many years, NREGA is here to stay. Please remember, NREGA is only National Rural Employment Guarantee. It's rural. It does not affect urban workers. 30% of India is living in urban areas. India is urbanizing at an amazingly rapid pace. So rural urban workers are not covered. Urban contract labor is not covered. So that's sorry for a very longish answer, but I believe the impact of NREGA on employment or even on the union budget is minuscule. It does have a significant impact on minimum wages, but I think on balance it's a good thing. And in fact, companies which are tapping into the rural wealth, like FMCG companies like ITC or Levers, or even cement companies like Ultratech or ACC also, they've all realized that rural spending is increasing. I think it's partly because of the minimum wages having gone up, or wage rates in rural areas have gone up. Second question, FSP, Food Security Bill. I have similar views that it was passed this year, but by the time we get around to implementing it, it will be almost a couple of months. So in this fiscal year, financial year, we'll probably see more than 20,000-25,000 crores being spent. In many states, there is a food security already implemented, like fiscal impact of the food security bill, it is something that the country can afford. But the kind of perverse incentives it creates, and there's a fundamental moral aspect to it, that, as I said, is the scope of discussion beyond today's context.
I have to close the session, and unfortunately I can't offer you Ajit over dinner or breakfast tomorrow because he's not here. So next time I have to close the session. Ajit, thanks a lot. I just wanted to ask Rakesh or Deepak if you had any closing remarks before we. Any thoughts on all of the economic and other predictions that Ajit has made? Something that you might want to share with the audience? Or?
No, nothing specifically. I think we are going through a tough time, and as Anil Singhvi earlier said, I think there is a crisis there is an opportunity in a crisis, and we should look for that opportunity in a crisis. It's the time for us to really build the right processes, right systems, right foundation in our businesses, and ensure that when things turn around, we are there to really capitalize on that. So we have to look for that. So it's not all gloom and doom, which is,
So little going beyond what he said, that rather than waiting for the opportunity, you create the opportunity. But that's where I look at, because if all of us are collectively managing so many industries and so much of GDP, I think with our own strength we can create opportunity and don't wait for the opportunity to come and wait for the time to change. We can change the times, and I think if that is the attitude we take, I think things will be far superior and faster.
Well, that's a very nice summation of the tone so far of everything that we heard from Lloyd Jones to Jamlin Norgay, Anil Singhvi, and now our panel. Please join me in thanking our panel for an excellent session. Given that we've sort of touched upon the politics of the country right now, I'm going to use the opportunity of having all of you here to ask a very quick question. Which political dispensation will worry you the most in the context of economic reforms for 2014? An NDA plus, an NDA-led coalition, a UPA-led coalition, or a third front? Which will worry you the most? The third front? And are you going to risk choosing between a UPA-led coalition and an NDA-led coalition? See, बहुत feeble voice है NDA. So the rest of you guys want the government back?
No way.
NDA-led coalition? Huh? Chalega. Okay, good.
Is it streaming out?
I'm cleverer than that. Thanks a lot. It's been a great afternoon. But before I close for this evening, I have a whole bunch of announcements to make, my privilege. The first is those of you who have not checked in, because we dragged you to lunch and then to the conference, please check in at the main reception. Those of you who are staying at the Taj, there's a shuttle that has been arranged for you. Seema and Rajesh are here. They will guide you so you can make it back in time for our really fun evening lined up from 8 o'clock. There is an ideas wall outside, in keeping with the launch of FinThinkers and the fact that this is about finance meets innovation. There is an ideas wall outside, and the best ideas are going to get voted on, simple voting, and then there is a prize at the end of it for the most voted on ideas. So please do take time out at breaks. You have a big break right now for an hour and a half almost. So as you're stepping out, there are markers and there's a ideas wall. Please pen down your thoughts. We have CFO India t-shirts just outside the hall. Please collect them on your way back. I have to tell you that the maximum and the fastest responses we have got in the run-up to this conference was to t-shirt sizes. So please do justice to our efforts and pick them up on your way out. The FinThinkers ceremony and dinner is at the Kulagar Hall. I'm sorry, but the rain did play a little bit of mischief with us, so we've had to move the venue indoors. It's a beautiful venue, but it's a little bit of a walk. So where you came in from for lunch in the afternoon, did all of you go to lunch? Yeah, you all know where. So just beyond that, there is signage, and that will take you to the Kulagar Hall, where the FinThinker ceremony is on. Please try and get there before 8, so we can start sharp at 8. We have an absolutely stupendous performance lined up for you, in addition to the gala evening with celebrating our FinThinkers for this year. Breakfast is at the Waterfront, which is the coffee shop. When you came down the stairs, lunch was on your right, breakfast is going to be on your left. There's a bunch of people who are staying at the Taj. Breakfast is served for you at the Taj, and then you'll be brought here on the shuttle in time for tomorrow morning. We are giving you a civilized start at 9:15 tomorrow morning, but there is a bunch of you who would hopefully be interested. What we've tried to do this year is pack a little bit more into the agenda outside the format of scheduled session. So we've spent time over the last few months choosing our favorite TED Talks. So for those of you who are interested, our editor's pick TED Talk of the day is going to be shown from 8:50 onwards right here tomorrow morning. So those of you who are up in time and would like to share in what the TED Talker of the day has to say, please try and make it here by 8:50 in the morning. Otherwise, 9:15 is the formal start to the day. Any questions you have, I had put up the CFO India team. Please feel free to ask any of us for ideas, guidance, whatever instructions that you need. Thank you so much for being a wonderful audience for the first half of the conclave. And I look forward to seeing you at the Kulagar short of 8 o'clock. Join me once again in thanking our panelists for their